Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Mahoney. This is my third year in a row of doing this. We have a group called the Wilderness History and Open Access. Paul Collins, myself, and a guy named Ted Stevens are the three principals in that business. It's a nonprofit that does a couple things. We have open access, so we try to clear trails. As you know, there's a lot of trees out there that have a tendency to fall down. It blocks a lot of the wilderness trails, and the Forest Service just doesn't have the resources to clear trails. So we have a lot of people who like to donate money and keep these trails open for us. The other aspect of our organization is history. We would just like to record, some stories, some of the legends, if you will, of backcountry aviation. And a number of people write books. Not many people record videos, and so that's what we're doing here today with Billy. And I don't know, Billy, if you want to give any introduction about community aviation at all?
Very simple, very short. We try to showcase people that know a lot of stuff and make it available to people that want to know more stuff. Okay, and that's what really this is all about. But communityaviation.com, these should be up within a week or two.
Awesome. So our guests today are on your left, Dick Williams, and then Amy Hoover sitting between us. And you might think that these people know a little bit about aviation. They do, but I will tell you they started their careers in other ways. Amy here is a failed geologist. And I say that only because that's the way she described it a few months ago when she gave an awesome talk down in Boise about backcountry flying.
I think I called it a rogue geologist.
A rogue geologist. There's some of that too. And then Dick over here is a well-known writer who has a flying problem. And if you haven't read his books, I highly recommend them. They are so entertaining. They're just fantastic books. I hope some of the stories that are written in some of his books come up today. I just highly encourage you to go out and buy one of those. They're fantastic. Speaking of books, these two wrote a book together. Primarily Amy, I think you're the primary author right here, Mountain Canyon and Backcountry Flying. It is the Bible on backcountry flying these days. The book was finished just a few years ago. I'm sure they'd love to sign a copy for you today if you'd like to do that. But it's just a fantastic book. I highly recommend it to anyone trying to learn the backcountry. And so it's funny, I teased Dick about being the writer, but really Amy is the college professor who has taken all of her knowledge along with Dick's great stories and great advice, and they've written this book, so it's fantastic. With that, let's get started. I have a series of questions here, and by the way, we'll get through some of these questions, and if anyone has any burning desire to ask a question, I think we're open to that as well. So we'll get started with Amy. Would you mind sharing just a little bit about writing a book about backcountry flying?
Oh, you skipped the first one.
Oh, well, we can jump back.
That's okay. You had asked how old we were when I soloed it. He's a lot older than me, so you know.
Oh, is that right?
I learned to find salmon, and I was actually a geologist and a river guide and working on the Frank Church and the Gospel Humps for a lot of years. And I didn't actually start learning to fly until I was 27 years old. But the reason I bring that up is my first flight in a little airplane was in a Brett Norman Islander in the Indian Creek.
Oh, wow.
So that's how I got into flying and in the backcountry. And it's like I said, gone rogue.
Yeah, awesome. Dick, I bet you were a lot younger.
I was 22, just out of college. Had a Triumph motorcycle I sold for $800, and that's what it took to get a pilot's license. In a Cessna 150, it was $10 an hour wet, and the instructor was $6 an hour. And yeah.
Wow.
Can't do that now.
$16 an hour. You can't even pay the taxes on the price to fly for that these days. Oh, that's incredible. Well, with that, I guess I'm a little bit lucky. I was able to solo when I was 18 years old, but only because I joined the military and they let me fly a little bit. Otherwise, it would have been much, much later. So let's get on to the book then.
Book. Well, it's interesting because when I was flying air taxi back here in the early 90s, we were teaching for the FAA. Actually, Dick started the first mountain flying clinic in Chalice in the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. And then later on in the early 90s, I was teaching at the FAA mountain flying clinic. And then a lady named Lynn Clark, who was flying out of McCall, called me up and said, I think us girls can do this. So we started the McCall Mountain Canyon flying seminars. And I had written the training materials and all that. They're still actually using. But then when I got this job as a college professor, I was teaching a college level class in mountain canyon flying. And the students said, why don't you just write a book?
Yeah.
So I sent off a proposal to ASA, the publisher, and they gave me a contract and took a sabbatical. And when I got started, I thought, it's better, these kind of things are better in a collaborative effort if you have the right person. So Dick was my first choice, called him up. He said, no, I'm retired, I don't want to do that. Then I sent him what I had, and he said, okay, that looks pretty good. So that's what started this whole co-authorship. And it's been fantastic, I'll have to say, because it is a textbook. It's got a lot of the technical knowledge, but then there's stories, not just Dick and I, but other people that Dick brought on board, and that we do accident analyses and stories, and it's just great because Dick, like I said, Dick is the storyteller, and that kind of added a whole new layer to the book. And it's been quite successful.
Yeah. I had originally 3 ideas in mind to cover in writing. And one was the history of the backcountry, and one was the stories and some of the early characters and people that I knew, and the third was the instruction. And I kind of told the stories in Notes from the Cockpit, and Richard Holm took care of the history in Bound for the Backcountry, volumes 1 and 2. Nobody can ever top that. That's the go-to history book. And with Amy, I had the opportunity to get into the instruction part, and could never have done it without Amy. Her little mind has all these equations and formulas and everything right at her fingertips. She's got all of that knowledge. She comes from a scientific aerodynamic background that's phenomenal, and I'm kind of the more seat of the pants, kind of more subjective type, so I think that worked pretty well coming together and getting the 9 other expert readers and all of those side stories, and we really wanted it to be all inclusive, all under one cover, getting all of the research, all of whatever we could find about mountain flying that had been written, even out of print, F.E. Potts from Alaska, things like that. We gathered all the stuff that we liked and put it in, and we left the stuff out that we didn't like. And then we put our own opinions in, and then we got the current expert's opinion, and it came out great. Rod Machado is, I think, the one who called it the next mountain flying Bible, and you don't get better than Rod, so we're proud of it.
Yeah. I'm curious, just as a bit of a follow-up, since you've written the book, have you learned anything? Have people provided you feedback to it? Any thoughts about if you were to write a version 2? What would you change?
The ASA actually contacted me this winter. They've sold, I don't know what their first printing was. They've done a second and third printing, but they're getting ready. They asked if we could do a second edition.
Right.
And the answer is yes. A lot of people said, hey, what about, I was down giving a seminar at the National Aerial Firefighting Academy last January, and there's people with way more experience than, in the firefighting, and
Sure.
They were giving ideas and always getting a hold of us and giving input. And so the next edition's probably going to have a couple more chapters, maybe including things that we hadn't thought of at first. I've got some ideas kicking around with some people. One of them's a friend who is was a flying trooper in Alaska, Mike Kincaid. I don't know if you've seen any of his stuff.
Yeah, I have.
He's probably going to contribute, and he writes.
Oh, awesome.
And then some folks up in Montana, maybe New Zealand, Alaska, just make it kind of more broad and add some new material and probably some new photos. So that you're not just buying the same book over again.
Right.
It's a second edition.
Right.
And I can add a little bit to that as far as what we've learned and myself and what I've relearned. And I've been telling students that lately. It's like after 50 years that I've been doing this, you forget some stuff. And it's nice to be able to go back and review some of this stuff. And you can't keep it all. I can't keep it all in this little pea brain. And that's one reason we sell it for Kindle. A lot of pilots like to carry it right in the airplane with them, and if they need to look at a formula or a rule of thumb, it's right there and handy. But I think flying, for the longer you do it, the more you're relearning and relearning stuff, the same stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's well stated. I know that's certainly true with me as well. I haven't flown quite as long, but 40-some years, and some of those basic lessons you kind of take for granted, you forget until you start teaching. I taught some high school kids yesterday who had never been in a little airplane, and you forget about the simple little basic things that we take for granted, and to them, it's like, how do you explain, how to turn an airplane? Something very simple. So, yeah, really fun. I'm curious, you guys have done a lot of different flying in your careers. Dick, you've done a wide variety of both hardcore instrument flying, jet flying, as well as backcountry. Can you tell me, what's your favorite kind of flying?
I've always been mission oriented. If I'm going out to do a game count, or I'm out there to help with a rescue or something, those are the flights I remember that stick in my mind. But I'll tell you, about 3 weeks ago, I was coming up the main Salmon Canyon by myself early in the morning with some water dogs around. Just not bad weather, but had to fly the canyon. As green as it could be, about every place I looked, I could either see an elk or a deer or a sheep eating the grass, smooth as glass, by myself in my Super Cub. Doesn't get much better than that.
Yeah, and it's awfully nice. I have to second that. I took a trip to Kavanaugh Bay on Wednesday this week in the Kodiak, which is not pressurized, so we had to stay lower. And to basically go the whole length of Idaho this time of year, oh my gosh, was it a gorgeous flight. Yeah. So much different. Amy, how about you? What's your favorite type of flying?
Well, you know, I started out flying air taxi back here, and I flew corporate for a little while, but I actually really enjoy teaching. I mean, I've been now teaching college and university for 25 years, whether it's instrument or in the simulators, but especially in the backcountry, because you get people that they come in with their own airplane, maybe that thousands of hours of flight time, but it's a whole new environment. Right. And I love just working with them to get a handle on their attitude, their airplane, just their whole perspective, their situational awareness, and then that light bulb goes off, and they just have such a great time. And I love instructing, so that's why I do what I do.
Yeah, well, I know you both are outstanding instructors, so appreciate that. And isn't it funny how the older you get, the more you read people, and you can adjust your instructing styles, I would bet, based on their history.
Well, yeah, it's not about me. It's about how to get into their way of learning, basically, and adjust accordingly.
Yep. Well, we're sitting here on a beautiful morning. Dick, you mentioned the flight 3 weeks ago and how pretty it is. I don't think we could ask for a better morning here at Root Ranch. This is fantastic. I'm curious if you guys, Paul Collins and I, who have helped set this up, we've been on the board of the Flying Bee for many, many years, and we just love these ranches. But I'm curious if you guys have any favorite stories about either Root Ranch here or Flying Bee.
Oh my goodness, too many for this morning. Yes, I'm sure we both do. My son was born in 1981, and when he was 2 weeks old, we came in here for a company party, and it was windy and gusty by the time we got in here in the afternoon. We had to land that way, and we were in a 207. My wife was in the front seat and holding the baby, and a plane full of employees and non-flying employees, and it wasn't a real fun flight. But we got on the ground here and pulled into the tie down and unloaded, and just kind of sat in the airplane, and everybody was saying what a great flight it was and how happy they were to be here, and I just looked at Linda and said, ignorance is bliss. But no, we've had some great parties here, some great times. One not really related to aviation. When Roger Thompson was the foreman here in the late 70s, they would take all the stock from here to the Bee after the end of hunting season at the end of November. And I got to be one of Roger and his assistant and me took 70 head of stock out from here to the Bee. It was a 2-day trip. We stopped at the Taylor Ranch overnight. We left at 4 in the morning. We went through cold meadows. It was 25 below with the steam coming off of the mules and the horses and wading through the snow. And you know, to me, the wilderness flying goes along with the whole entire wilderness experience, and that was something that I'll never forget. You know, from the root to the Bee, with horses, that kind of experience you just don't forget.
Yeah, boy, amen to that. I've never been able to do that yet, but someday I would love to do it. Yeah, and it's kind of scary to think about leaving here in November with that deep snow, you know, but they make it out every year somehow. So, Amy, how about you? Any training stories? I know sometimes we'll bring students in here.
Well, I do, but you know, back to it's interesting. The first time I came to the Root Ranch I wasn't even a pilot yet, because I was guiding on the Middle Fork of the Salmon. Right. I was a river guide. Of course, I was going into the Bee, and I've been going in there for 40 years. But as river guides, we were like, woo, airplane ride. So we got to come in here. They fed us breakfast. That wasn't there yet in the lodge. It was in the old cook shack. Mm-hmm. And then it was basically slave labor, because they fed us breakfast, the air taxis, and we went down to Cabin Creek and loaded hay bales all day, right? We just thought it was great because we got a free airplane ride and a free breakfast. But we stopped in here at the route to do that and loaded hay bales all day. But I've done a lot of backpacking around this whole area besides river guiding. And one year we started here at the route and we were backpacking down to the B. With 3 women, and we loaded our backpacks and we headed down. We thought we might drop down a different trail. Well, it hadn't been cleared. And there was, after the fire, there was deadfall with trees, and you're having to climb over them. And we were so tired before we even got down to Big Creek. We got in our tents. It was still daylight, and you could hear the wolves just howling. And it was so beautiful just to be out there. And that's one thing, like Dick mentioned, this country. I've done geology here. I've backpacked. I've river guided. I've flown. And it's just such a special area. I know we're going to talk about that a little more. But the Root Ranch in particular is one of my favorite spots because it's got a lot of history, including my own personal history. And so I do bring people in and we stop and have breakfast or something, and it's just such a special place.
It really is. We're up here in the middle of Chamberlain Basin, many, many miles away from the nearest road, for sure. I'd hate to guess, probably a 40, 50-mile walk to the nearest road. So, yeah, it's a long, long ways. With that in mind, you guys have both mentioned being in here 40-some years ago. Just curious how things have changed. Amy, you probably might remember it more than...
Yeah, I've done a lot of ground pounding, both in the gospel hump and doing geology. Definitely a lot more of it has been burned. Fire. There's a lot more fire damage in the last 40 years or so. As far as the territory itself, the rocks don't change and the geology doesn't change, but there's probably, in the flying world, there's just more activity, more flying. That's partly why Dick and I tried to put across in our book and some of the seminars that AOPA is doing and things, is just how to help people recognize that it's a special area and you need to treat it as such, as far as not just safety, but how you operate in this area safely, but also respecting it, respecting the wilderness, respecting the other users. I mean, we got people hiking and rafting and hunters, and just so we can all work together. Because as we all probably know, it's very delicate. It's a delicate ecosystem. It's a delicate area that if it's not managed correctly, or if people come in and don't kind of manage it themselves, we could get the resource taken away from us as far as use. And the American people deserve to come in and enjoy this beautiful place, and people from internationally as well. So I think as how it's changed over the years, just more users and more different users. And so the advocacy is, let's go figure out how to work together, how to be safe, how to be courteous. And Dick may add some more to that. And as pilots, we have a special niche in that we can be stewards of this area, and we can help people coming in from out of state and out of the area to just understand how special it is and how to help preserve it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think people who've read my books know that I'm not a big fan of the Forest Service and the federal bureaucracy in general, but I do have to hand it to them when it comes to the Frank and the Middle Fork floating business. They have that figured out. It's on a permit system. It's very difficult to get a permit. Kind of makes you wonder, but you can go into one of those camps if you're a boater, which I am, and Amy is, and go to an assigned campground, and you can't tell if someone's been there. There's not a cigarette butt, there's not an ash, there's no human waste, there's no nothing. It's they've got that nailed, and that part hasn't changed. In the Frank, and it works well. As far as aviation, what I've seen change is more capable airplanes. These airplanes have more power, and they have better STOL characteristics, and they're going to more of the more challenging airstrips. Back in 1979, a lot of people didn't know anything about the Big Creek 4, or even where they were, or how to get to them.
But they were in regular use, right?
Yes, they were.
Thank you.
Yes, and we have that documented. Absolutely, thank you. We're in regular use, but to the average recreational pilot coming in from out of state, they weren't aware of them very much.
Right.
And there was some use, but not gaggle flying like we're seeing now. Well, I saw gaggle flying in Chamberlain and at Indian Creek. I remember in 79 or 80 seeing 14 airplanes on the ground and 16 coming in the air. And as an air taxi pilot, we just pulled away. Just went away for 15 or 20 minutes because people were on the wrong frequency, and they were saying they were landing upstream when they were landing downstream. or they were at a different airstrip than where they thought they were. It was before Loran. So those things have changed it. One thing I'd like to say that Mike Doris, I think, pointed out last year when you interviewed him, by the way, his daughter Katie is here today, I think somewhere. What legendary backcountry family. Mike said we wouldn't have a wilderness without airplanes, which is a very interesting way to look at this. If we didn't have airplanes that service these old homesteads and these pioneers back here, there would be roads and railroads, and it would look entirely different. So I think we can thank the airplane for having the wilderness.
Yeah, I thought that was very profound last year. I hadn't thought of it that way, and he's absolutely right. Yeah, we would find ways to access this, and it would not be pretty. So, you mentioned working with the Forest Service. They do some things wonderfully well. BLM, same thing. FAA. But those organizations have changed some. I know back when the Frank Church was formed, I've heard plenty of stories about how they wanted to collaborate closely with the backcountry ranchers back here, and then as time has gone on, there's probably less collaboration. And I'm just curious, with your experience, how have the interactions with those federal agencies changed?
It hasn't gotten any better. I think it gets worse, not better. I worked for the BLM. I was the chief pilot for the BLM for 6 years, and worked for them another 2 as a smoke jumper pilot. And you see, they're kind of when they get into firefighting, it's kind of a quasi-military kind of organization, but they're not full military, so there's parts of it they don't get, and they don't communicate well with the public. There's a lot of controversy about the fire. What was the name of the fire that started up here by Sulphur Creek 2 years ago, and all the ripple effect that it's had now with the Sulphur Creek Ranch and the boaters and the river, and the economics ripple through all kinds of ways.
And that fire, they could have put that fire out the first week it was there, and we all thought it was basically not a problem, and then that blew up, and now here we are 2 years later and still feeling the impacts of that fire.
Yes.
Yeah. And Sulphur Creek's still closed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty discouraging.
Yeah.
I was a corporate pilot for 17 years, and every year it was a big corporation based in Omaha, and every year I saw it become bigger and bigger and bigger and more like the government every year, and it's discouraging where you can't make a decision without having a committee. And I know there's good people in the government who are just handcuffed by the procedures and the red tape and the bureaucracy. There's some very good individuals in the government, but it's just become this huge wheel.
Yeah, exactly. I think you have to push back a little bit and not be afraid of that. Yeah, absolutely. Amy, you mentioned the fires a little bit earlier. It does seem like, I've only been flying back here for about 20 years, but it does seem like these fires are perhaps a little bit worse. I'm just curious, especially from your geology background and all that, and understanding the backcountry. What do you think in terms of wildfires?
Well, fire goes back to the management, which Dick was talking about. You're in a wilderness, so how do you manage it? And it's even more than fire; it's the big picture. And this is not meant in a derogatory way, but I see people who say they're environmentalists, which is great, but they don't maybe understand the whole picture. When I was river guiding, people say, "Oh, hunting is bad," and I'm like, "Well, wait a minute, back up here. You have an elk population, for example, that had a huge territory. Well, now we've squeezed them into this small area, like the Frank Church, the Gospel Hump. They have to be managed. You have to cull the herd. Well, the hunting outfitters, I guarantee you that the rafters, the hunters, those outfitters, they are stewards of this resource, much more than somebody from outside that doesn't quite understand it. And so, the hunting outfitter will come in, they care about the resource, they take care of it. By taking care of the elk population, the hunting is part of it. And I think some of it's just educating. People would say that, and then I'd kind of explain to them, well, here's what it really is with this resource, and you have to call the herd, you have to manage it. And the fire's part of that whole big picture. Because if you start getting more fire, maybe the fire could have been fought, but in the wilderness there's a let burn. Well, then that destroys the part of the resource that then goes back to the food chain. The animals don't have the foraging, the herbivores and the ungulates, and then so the higher up the food chain you go, well, if the elk population dies, then the cats. There's a lot of cats back here. You don't see them as much, but there are wild bobcats and cougars, and then they might be dropping off. And of course, the wolf, that's a bit controversial because the wolves were here, and then they brought more in, and now they're kind of expanding, so now they're having to manage the wolves. Of course, you got bears, and so, you know, the whole resource. I think the fire is not just, oh, it burned up, it looks bad, but it's the whole ecological balance in this area. And I think more and more fire means that it's throwing that balance off. And so we're seeing change in the flora and fauna across the board, plus the erosion. You know, you get erosion, and then it cuts away the hillsides, and then you can't grow back the forest, and you're changing the vegetation. Now this cheatgrass is coming in here. It's a non-native species. The cheatgrass is just taking over. As you burn a hillside, the cheatgrass will grow up, and then you've destroyed everything. So it's the fire. Yes, I've seen more fire. I'm sure you have too. I mean, I remember back in '89, the big Bounty Creek fire was like a huge deal. Yeah. Or the Mortar Creek fire. What year was
Mortar
that?
Creek in '79 was
79, yeah.
65,000 acres, and I think it was the first what we called big fire. And now it would be considered
just small.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Tiny.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And some places have burned 2 or 3 times. You know, up here at Bergdorf in 2000 was the big fire, and the president came in and everything. It's burned like 3 times since then. I don't know what's left to burn.
Wow. You know, we had a fire here at Root Ranch about 4 years ago that was west, and in fact they shut down the main salmon for rafting for a few weeks anyway with that one. And we came in, the Flying Bee and Root Ranch staff came in and met with the higher ups who were fighting the fire, and they said, you know, this is a really slow burning fire, and it's burning really hot, and that's good. It gets rid of a lot of the trash, if you will, in the understory, and puts it back into its native state. And their point was, we need to burn this stuff up every so often, let it clear out, and then maybe these subsequent fires aren't so bad. You know, hopefully, yeah, we'll see. It does offer opportunities. I'm curious. Have you seen any changes in terms of the future, in terms of recreational opportunities back here?
Future. Well, I mean, as Dick pointed out, they do an amazing job here with the river rafting, which I did for 10 years. Hunting, hiking, flying, of course. I mean, there's so much recreational use. Again, I go back to, it's our job, I think our job, meaning those of us that have been here and care about it, to help educate people that are coming in. You know, if you're going to do a backpack trip, what's safe, what's reasonable, what the resources are if you're going down the river, or if you're doing a hunt, going horseback riding. I think the recreation, I don't know if the type of recreation has changed that much, but there's just more and more people coming in to do it. So that's the kind of the issue there, is how do we put, just like the animals, how do you put more people into a smaller space and make it work? Right.
And Dick, would you say, is that the biggest challenge? Or what's the biggest challenge for recreational flying back here?
Doing it safely, I guess. You know, and our liberties are at risk. As we mentioned earlier, there are lots of people watching us who are not fans of aviation, and that's a big challenge, to educate people to not do the gaggle flying and low-level canyon flying. It's just not like it was in the old days. You can't get away with that stuff. It's too bad, because it's fun, frankly. You know, Mike Doris and I have talked about that. Gee, it was fun to be able to do that. Yeah, we were spoiled. Yeah, we did it. We can't do it now. Sorry. Or we put it at risk for everybody. It'll get shut down like the Grand Canyon, like they've tried to shut down other places. So I do want to mention, you know, Joe Corlett had a fantastic program for many, many years, and hasn't done it the last couple of years, maybe because of Sulphur Creek problems, but bringing handicapped people into the wilderness. There are so few ways to get into the wilderness.
I got some good news on that front.
Good.
Next weekend, I think it is, at the Flying Bee, we're hosting them again.
Within reach. All right.
Excellent.
Yeah. And
super important program.
yeah, I was really lucky. I got to fly one of those here a few years ago, and basically it is handicapped people who just can't get around, don't have access to this beautiful country. And he gets volunteers, a lot of the Part 135. I'm sure the Doris brothers will bring some people up. And oh my gosh, is that fun to bring these people up and let them see this natural beauty.
Yeah.
Really rewarding for pilots, isn't it?
Yes, for sure.
To do that.
Yep.
You know, and I'll add something to that, because I'm an educator.
Yep.
But I think a lot of it is about education. I was just yesterday, I was at Indian Creek, given some instruction, and a total of 19 airplanes ended up coming in, you know, and they didn't know. They hadn't been there, and they were parking over where they probably shouldn't have parked. And the Forest Service and I were just like, okay, well, the tie-downs are over here, and here's what works. But as we were going to take off, these airplanes were just coming in low over the river, doing straight-in approaches. Well, the conflicting traffic's taken off the other way, and we took off, and 3 of them came around the corner right in our face. We got over the side of the canyon. So I just called them on the radio. I said, hey, straight-ins are not recommended. Because you have conflicting traffic, it's recommended just to fly a pattern, take a look. And the guy said, oh, we didn't know. And so he flew a pattern. And that's my point is there's so much information out there. It kind of makes you wonder why they don't know. The state of Idaho puts out great information on their airstrips, SOPs. The AOPA Air Safety Institute, Richard McSpadden, has a whole backcountry forum, which we actually have a stewardship for Idaho airstrips on there. I actually wrote that about 2 years ago, and we put the out for Idaho. But people, I don't think anybody has malintent. They want to come out and have fun and be safe, but they just don't know. And that's what our book is about, and other resources is, hey, here's some ways you can help yourself to be safe and be respectful and not go out there and hurt yourself or hurt other people. But I'd say a lot of them just they don't know. So how do we get the message out? And I think we're doing a pretty good job, but we can probably always do a little better.
Yep. One of my favorite podcast authors is a guy named Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist at Wharton. And he does what he calls lightning rounds. So you guys ready for a lightning round? Fire quick questions. Here's the topics. What's your favorite passenger, most famous, funniest, and perhaps maybe not someone by name, but some type of passenger you might not want to fly with. So Dick, I'll start with you. Your favorite passenger and why?
Wow. The favorite is probably the one who's really excited to see the backcountry. When I was flying for Harrah's Middle Fork Lodge with a Twin Otter, we would get high rollers in from Reno, and they'd come in the private jet, and we'd put them in the Otter and take them to the Middle Fork Lodge. And they had gold jewelry on and everything, and they would go open the bar in the back of the Otter or pull down a table, and we'd be playing cards on the way to Thomas Creek, where they could have been looking out the window at this fantastic, and we'd always make a run by the sawtooths, and you look back there, and none of them are even looking outside. So those were not my favorite people. My favorite people were the ones who were excited about seeing it and wanted to know where they were and wanted to know more about the country.
How about, Amy, how about favorite for you?
Well, I do a lot of instruction, and I get a lot of military pilots. They fly F-16s and F-15s and A-10s, and they fly for the airlines, and they come to fly with me in their Cessna or their Super Cub, and they're always just so like, wow, grateful and amazed, and they're all good pilots, and we go out and have fun. 2 years ago, I got Jeff Skiles hired me to fly with him in his 185, and that was pretty cool because it was smoky one day, and we sat in the hangar, and I got the inside story on landing on the Hudson. He was with Sullenberger. He was the FO.
I was going to say, I should know the name, but okay.
Yeah, you should. But anyway, I got to sit down and talk to Jeff and get, like I said, the inside story on the Hudson.
Wow,
so that was kind of cool.
That's fascinating. All right, who's the most famous person you've flown with, Dick?
Probably Sir Edmund Hillary.
Oh.
I got to fly him a couple of times. He went down the Middle Fork with the Guth brothers, and of course Norm Guth flew him in, but I met him at the airport in Salmon. And then later he was floating Hell's Canyon with Masoner, and he was trying out some gear for a company. I can't remember which company. And I flew him into Council to meet the trip, and then flew him back out. A very humble, interesting man for sure.
Wow, that is fascinating. Maybe did I just hear your most famous one?
No, actually, I flew with John Denver.
Oh, wow.
But it wasn't here. It was actually in Baja, because I used to go down, and I was a sea kayaking guide and whale watching guide in Baja in the winters. And John Denver came down with his friend in the 210 and spent about a week with us. We were filming for the Cousteau Society and the whales and stuff. And John, what an amazing guy. You never know that a voice is enhanced. He sat around the fire with his guitar.
Oh, no.
And just sang for us. Oh, it was amazing.
Wow, you can't pay enough money for that.
No, I got to be on the beach with John Denver and his guitar.
Wow. That's impressive. And what a great story, especially considering what sadly happened to him later on. But, wow, that's really cool. Funniest? Who's, just curious, Dick, any funny people you flew with?
I flew with Rich Little into Indian Creek. If you're old enough, you remember Rich Little.
Oh, yeah.
No, he never cracked a smile. And I thought that was funny.
Oh, that's great. Amy, anybody you can remember? Anybody?
Yeah, so
made you
those
laugh?
of you, remember the Brady Bunch?
Yeah.
Remember the maid, Alice?
Yes.
Took her in on a flight, and her twin sister, they're twins, and they just had me cracked up the whole
I'll
way.
be darned.
They're just sharp and smart, and the actress on the program, was always had these funny quips. They
Yeah.
were like that.
Just naturally.
Yeah, just naturally.
Wow.
She was probably ad-libbing on the show. I don't know.
I just want to know, did she have a skirt on and an apron? Or
No.
that's what I remember anyway. But yeah, isn't that funny? Oh, that's great. Well, you might have mentioned flying with some high rollers and not really enjoying necessarily flying them, but we don't need names. That's not fair. But people you prefer not to fly with. I mean, just...
Bill Harris' third wife.
Okay.
After we had gotten rid of the Twin Otter, we were supposed to go to Haley and pick her up and her boyfriend, and there was some misunderstanding somewhere. I showed up in a 185, and she was expecting the Twin Otter, and she wasn't nice, but her boyfriend was even worse. So, yeah, I won't forget that one. But Sherry, Mr. Harris' first wife, was a real gem.
Oh, wow.
And I flew her also. And she was a very nice lady.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. You've probably had a bad student or two that you would prefer not to fly with again.
It's like you say, there's no bad dogs, just bad owners.
True.
Well, there's really no bad students. Actually, I screen people, quite honestly. If they call me up and they already know it all, why are they hiring me? But it's pretty rare to get somebody like that. But sometimes you get somebody who just is unwilling to take advice, and that's fine.
Yep. Fair enough. Just curious, some other people you've worked with. That's been one of the pleasures of my life, is just meeting some fantastic people, right? I mean, there's some real gems in aviation, and I'm just curious, either one of you, I'm just curious what, or maybe Amy.
We both had the same answer on the phone.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Jim Larkin
Oh,
is
yes.
one of them. We dedicated the book to Jim.
Yep. I
How
ride
can
by
we start even saying what all there is to say about Jim?
Yeah.
He
I ride
was-
my bike by his little
Yeah.
airstrip that he has south of Boise and think
Yeah.
about him every time.
He flew C-47s over the hump in the war, in World War II. He came back, chief jump pilot, had Larkin Air. He flew with you in the Otter, but he was just. Here's an example. When Jim was in his 70s, I mean, everybody here combined, our aviation knowledge wouldn't even equal his. I mean, it was true. But I'd go to an FAA seminar or a workshop, and Jim would be there. And he used to teach for us in the mountain flying
Right.
school, and it was just that. He was one of my original mentors, and the whole concept of this guy knows everything, and yet he was there learning, and he was the first one to say there's always more to learn, and he was such a gentle, kind man and an amazing pilot, and you could probably go more about Jim too. I don't know.
Well, one interesting thing about him that I don't think very many people knew is he was the designated examiner for the Ford Trimotor. So if you wanted to pick up a type rating and a Ford Trimotor, Jim Larkin was one of the few people in the country that you would go to. But you raise a great point, because I don't think any of us can survive without some good mentors. We have to learn from other people. And I had some great ones. I had Bob Black from Grangeville, Mac Asher, who was a member here, Carol Jarvis, who first hired me at Salmon Air Taxi, Jim, of course, Rex Lanham, the Guth brothers. If I hadn't been able to soak up their knowledge, and if they hadn't generously given it to me, I'm sure I wouldn't be here. I was a pilot examiner for 10 years, and so I got to fly with hundreds of pilots, and it was an interesting thing for me to do that during that 10 years. You see the normal 80% that are kind of in the middle, and you see that bottom 10% who probably shouldn't really be within 100 feet of an airplane, and you see that top 10% who are just awesome, and then you see that top 2%. Those Charles Lindberghs, those Bob Hoovers, isn't that your uncle?
In my opinion, well, in my opinion too, I'll throw Mike Doris in there.
Oh, yeah.
His father, Bill, and Mike were two of my original mentors. I bought a little Cessna 120. I barely had my pilot's license wet, and I couldn't take another person, so I'd go sit with Bill, Katie's grandfather. Hey, Bill, I want to go in here. Well, watch out for this tree and this wind over this rock and this and that. And he was right 100% of the time. And then Mike Doris was, I mean, in my opinion, he's probably the most gifted backcountry pilot out there at the moment. He's just,
Yes, I would
and
agree.
he knows the area, but he's also a very generous guy. And he'll take the time to help you out. Doesn't matter who you are. He'll give you his wit. He doesn't keep it here. He shares it. And, you know, there's so many of those people out there that, like Dick said, how can we not? And that's why we're doing what we're doing, is to pay it forward. You know, we had help from those people. Let's give it to the next generation.
There have been a couple, I'll mention their names. Bob Hanna is one of that 1 or 2%. A guy named Lockie Chrysler, who was my boss when I flew the Otter for John McCaw. And actually, I feel my son is. I feel he's one of those. I taught him from the time he was that tall, and from what he does now and the way he flies an airplane is like, you just stand in awe. And it's so special just to be around some pilots like that. That was the best thing about being an examiner, was to be able to be with some of the best of the best of the best.
Yeah. Boy, my hat's off to him. He was an early cadre of the F-22, and that's an amazing airplane, and what an honor for him to fly that, and I'm sure he flies it really well.
And one of the highest time pilots in the F-22 now.
I can believe it.
So,
yeah, an amazing machine, and doing good work over in the Pacific where we need it. So, you know, mentioned airplanes, F-22, arguably the best airplane in the world, fighter-wise anyway. And I say this with a bit of hesitancy as we're here in the middle of the Husky fly-in. But I see some Pipers out there, and I see some Cessnas, and I'm just...
That was kind of a rigged question.
It was a rigged question. But I'm curious about your favorite airplanes. And you guys each own different airplanes, and so I'm curious about that. I personally have got to fly a lot, and my favorite airplane is whichever one I'm in at the time. But I'm just curious
Stole my
about
answer.
you. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
What do you think, Dick?
Well, I love the Lear 45. Lots of power, and we used to get that thing. We'd get limited to 10,000 feet coming out of Pasco, and so the 250 knot rule didn't apply, so we just run it up to full power to 320. It redlined at 320, and we have to pull the power back before we get our clearance to go to 210, and then we just cob it and pull it up, and the VSI pegged at 10,000 feet a minute, and we didn't know how much above that we were doing. And we'd get to 210 and level off, and Seattle Center would often say, "Impressive." It was fun. We rarely did it with passengers unless it was one or two who enjoyed that kind of flying. As far as the backcountry, the Twin Otter is just unbelievable. If the airstrip was wide enough to take its 65-foot wingspan, you get in and out of there.
Wow.
Pretty incredible airplane. As long as we're talking favorites, worst probably the short Sherpa. The government, the BLM, got 7 of them from the Air Force and used them for firefighting, smoke jumpers, paracargo, and hauling people. And they work well in Alaska. They work well in the colder, lower temps. They did not work well in the Great Basin or the high density altitudes, too thin a wing, and I didn't like the airplane. I was the examiner for the type rating in that airplane, but I was not fond of the airplane.
Well, I went through the Air Force Test Pilot School, and that was one of the airplanes we flew.
Yes.
Because we had airplanes that were really good, and we had airplanes that weren't very good, and they wanted to show us the differences. You know, so yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. But at the same time, it had a mission, and the mission, as I recall, was in Europe flying engines around. So engines around for fighters, and it was a very inexpensive way of doing that. And so that's what it was designed for. It did that one mission really well, and that was about it. Yeah. So Amy, how about you?
Well, I have to admit, I've gone to the dark side. I'm on floats now.
Oh, wow.
And I'm loving it. And you really can't beat an old radial Beaver on floats. You just can't beat it. It's a classic. It's like flying a big Super Cub, you know? It's just amazing. My least favorite airplane, I flew for a car dealership down in Boise for a while, and we had a Mitsubishi MU2. I just never got used to that airplane.
Yeah.
In fact, the other pilot flew F-18s, and he said this thing's more complicated than my jet was.
Right.
And it just, it was always a little touchy.
Yeah, that airplane had a little history, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're not seeing very many of them around
Very
anymore.
many. They're
So,
fast. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of favorites, I'm just curious about favorite airstrip up here in the backcountry. Well, it could be anywhere, and you guys know a lot more than I do about. I mean, I know Idaho very well. Not much beyond that, but I'm curious about your favorite airstrip.
At the moment, it's anywhere there's water.
Ah.
Because I'm on my floats, right?
Yeah, true. I set myself up for that one, didn't I?
Cheater.
Yeah.
A few years ago, we got another airstrip opened. It's called Marble Creek. It's up Marble Creek a few miles. And I had the honor of being asked to be the first fixed-wing airplane to land there. And that's the first new airstrip in the Frank Church in over 40 years. And that was an honor, but boy, I didn't want to screw it up. It was half the length. It wasn't officially open. They had a ditch going across, so it was half the length of what it is now. And I thought about it the night before. You know, I was light on fuel. I was by myself. I wasn't going to do it unless it was perfect, because, boy, I didn't want that as part of my history. It'd be the first one to try to land on a new airstrip in the Frank and not be successful at it. So that's probably my favorite. I think there's several airstrips that are underrated as far as difficulty and challenge, and I would put Lower Loon Creek in that category. Almost every professional pilot back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s had an issue at one time or another at Lower Loon, including myself. And it's easy to go into with a Cub or Husky Scout, but a loaded 207 or 185, it gets windy. It's a little longer now. It's a couple hundred feet longer than it was then. But a lot of these airstrips, and Mackie Bar was the same way. Carol Jarvis used to tell me when that was open and air taxis were using it, people aren't giving that respect they need. The South Fork comes into the main, and the air is squirrely, and it gets to be 100 degrees down there, and it won't cool off at night. Those rocks soak up that heat, and can be 9 o'clock at night and still be 100 degrees down there. And I think there's a couple of airstrips around that just don't, they demand more respect than they're getting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've gone in and out of that Lower Loon with 206s, max gross weight in and out, no problem. But you take a less capable airplane and you get a tailwind?
Yeah.
Scary. Yeah, I've been humbled in situations where you think you shouldn't have any problem.
I think just about all of us have.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Mackie Bar, because the 135 outfit I flew with, we had the contract with Mackie Bar at the time in the early 90s. So I'd go in and out of there all day long,
Yep.
you know, hauling hay cubes and
Yep.
propane and passengers off the river. And our company policy was you do not bring a full load out of there past about 9:30.
Yep.
We'd shuttle them to Chamberlain. So these people come off the river, you load half their group up and drop them in Chamberlain, go, I'll see you in a little bit later, and they're sitting there in the middle of the wilderness, and you just take off and leave them, go back, get the rest of the load, go back and then take it out. But Mackie Bar for sure, because I have a lot of time in and out of there, and all of them get.
Yeah, we've done the same thing at Wilson Bar, just right upstream.
Yeah.
Same thing. All the lighter load out, you just have to do it.
Yeah, but you know the thing about airstrips, I know we're sitting in the middle of the Frank and talking about the Frank, but there's so many great places out there. I've now been flying in the Washington Cascades a lot more.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some great places in the backcountry there, and in a national park up in Stehekin, and
cool.
just wherever you are. You know, if you're in Ohio or Texas or Arkansas or Idaho, there's places to go, and challenging places and fun places. And get out and enjoy it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned flying for a company out of Omaha earlier. That's where I'm from originally. And I was home a couple years ago, and I just looked at a sectional chart, and here's a private little airstrip of a little draw 5 miles away from my parents' house that I had no idea was even there. And it's someone's little private airstrip cut in amongst some trees, and I went up and looked at it like, oh, this looks like Idaho, you know? And who would have thought, you know, they're in the middle of, well, Nebraska, Omaha area, that, you know, there'd be a little strip like that. But, yeah, pretty cool. For sure. Dick, you mentioned first flight into Marble Creek. I'm understanding you've been very instrumental on another one that we're trying to open, Hoodoo Meadows. And I'm just curious, this is not on my list of questions here, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about Hoodoo. My understanding is we're going to be opening that place this summer. There's work going on there, and maybe if we're lucky, you can be the first one to go into that one.
Well, I guess I was one of the last ones, so I don't need to be the first one.
No, that's true. Yeah.
But I think it's going to be another great asset to Idaho, and thanks to basically Idaho Aeronautics, getting the special use permit, signing that, working with the Forest Service, saying, hey, we want this, we're going to help take care of it. The alphabet groups below that are volunteering time and money and labor to make this work. It's just another airstrip in our back pocket. The more we can get, the better. There was nothing wrong with it back in the 80s, and there won't be anything wrong with it again. We're going to have to really do our due diligence on education, because it will be the highest airstrip in Idaho. And I remember going in there, the air starts moving around about 9 o'clock in the morning. You want to be out of there or camped by 9 a.m. But it's in a good location. It's a good spot. It will be a great gateway to the Bighorn, the Bighorn Craigs. The hiking trails are right there. There's lakes nearby. It's going to be a great asset. Thank you to State Aeronautics.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you for that. We've been talking about a lot of great flights. Most rewarding flight you've had? Just curious, Amy? You probably had a lot of them.
There's so many of them. I mean, there's just nothing like Dick said. When you're by yourself in a beautiful place, in the sun. I remember. That's right. I had just gotten my private pilot license down in Blackfoot. And I was flying back to Salmon, where I learned to fly. So I'm a brand new private pilot, Cessna 150, coming up through the Persimmon Valley. And there were thunderstorms all across it, and the sun was setting, hitting these thunderstorms. And I just always remember that flight, because I got a wet signature on my private pilot license. And I was thinking, wow, the whole place is mine, and the whole point is how amazing it is, and how much gratitude we should have that we have this special place, and that we can have those kind of experiences.
You mentioned that. I'm curious, what's an important aspect of this wilderness history that might get lost? What do we need to remember about this Frank Church wilderness, or wilderness in general?
It's going to be here a lot longer than we are. I mean, we're sitting here on the Idaho batholith, which is 65 million years old, and then it got eroded. We got all the animals and the great forests, but I think the people part of the history is interesting. Take Mile High Ranch. Who would go stick a homestead up on the side of a mountain? Right? Well, they had a spring, that's why. But these people that came in here, if you read Richard Holmes' book or Court Conley, some of his books, these pioneers were rough, rugged, tough people, and they were coming into this country just with mules and walking and setting up homesteads. And unfortunately, the Wilderness Act in 1964 was named after Frank Church, and then in 1980, the Frank Church was designated by his name. And of course, we got the Gospel Hump, the Selway Bitterroot, some, the Eagle Cap and everything over here close to us in Oregon. But I think, unfortunately, what's happened here on the Frank is a lot of that human history was literally destroyed when the Forest Service came in, because they just burned down the ranches, tore them up, buried them. Took all that part out, and that's sad in my opinion, because the human history, the rocks are 65 million years old, the trees are thousands of years old, the humans came in and started making an impact, and some of that's just been wiped out, and it's really too bad in my opinion, because that's part of the history. So hopefully we won't lose it completely. We've lost the physical places, a lot of them, but because of the authors and the books, and we're trying to bring some of that in, and I don't know what you think about that.
I think nobody else could have said those rocks were 65 million years
I agree. It's like we have
awesome.
a geologist.
That's awesome. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think you answered that question. I want to back up and talk about rewarding flights for me. First, a funny one, because I remember coming out of many times coming out of Indian Creek, a long day, hauling gear in, low water, smoky fires. But on that last flight, headed back to Salmon, you're empty in a 206 or a 207, and the sun is at your back, and you haven't been empty like all day, but you're light and you're headed home, and it's like that song keeps going through my head. When do you say Budweiser, because I can taste it. 20 minutes, I'm going to be home. But I said earlier I like mission flying, and that relates to things like rescues, medical emergencies that I've been able to help on and say I contributed to saving a life, or dropping gear to a buddy at Cold Meadows right over the hill here in November in the snow in the pitch black dark.
Wow.
When it got 25 below in Stanley that night, so probably 30 below up there. Those make you feel good. I saw an accident happen at Chamberlain, a doctor and his family on board. They didn't burn, they weren't badly hurt, a couple of broken arms. I was able to land and fly them to McCall and help. Those things you just don't forget.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, that's a valuable part of the resource out back here, is to have that network to come in and help people who are here.
Absolutely.
Aviation is a valuable part
Absolutely.
of that.
Exactly. Exactly. Speaking of aviation, one of the newest technology things is a thing called social media. And I think that's also why we're seeing more airplanes back here, right? Everybody's got a little camera on their airplane and putting things up so we all can enjoy it. But I'm curious, Dick, how have you seen social media change our aviation?
Oh, wow. It's like the internet. There's a very, very good side and there's a very, very bad side. And it's the same with YouTube, comes to mind. And what Richard McSpadden is doing with the Safety Institute in AOPA with, calls that Zoom meetings, and then it gets on an internet and gets on his website. Incredibly positive, good educational stuff. On the other end, there's people who want to have their face on the camera, and you get to see them a lot while they're taxiing out and taking off, and they, some of them are good and some of them aren't, and you can get some pretty bad information out there. So it's definitely a double-edged
Well,
sword.
and I think the issue of that too is somebody sitting in Texas or Florida or California or wherever, they don't know how to discern the difference. I mean, obviously the stuff Richard's doing is great, but the YouTube, I'll tell people, I watched a YouTube of that, or I watched several YouTubes. I'm like, well, I got nothing, because I don't know what you watched. I don't know if it showed you something that was good or bad or the wrong way to do things. And, keeping in mind that here in the Frank Church, in order to film, if it's film for profit, commercial filming, you have to have a permit. And maybe the guys making the YouTubes know it or they don't know it, but they're out there making money off it. So and then drones are completely illegal in a national park or Forest Service, in a wilderness area. So the general consumer, the public, doesn't know that. So then they'll come in and want to do the same thing. And I think that's escalating to the point where it goes back to that, the managing agencies, the Forest Service, the BLM, the Park Service, wherever we are, can take that as fodder to say, well, we're going to limit access. We're going to limit, and then who really suffers? It's the hunting outfitters that make their livelihood off it, the rafters that make their livelihood, the backcountry ranchers. Because if you shut out aviation, you can't supply this ranch. Right? And so it's really a bigger picture. It's the economics as well as the environmental part of it. And some of these outfitters are third, fourth, fifth generation making their living off of taking care of the wilderness and bringing people in to hunt responsibly, for example. So the social media, I think the good part is awesome, and then there's that other part that it's a bigger thing than just, woohoo, I'm flying my airplane around in a canyon. It can have all this domino effect for what's, like I said, the economics of the local people as well, and the environment. And then people coming in and crashing their planes because they watch somebody do it on YouTube and they try the same thing and it didn't work out so well.
Yeah, well, conditions can change, right? They could come in on a beautiful, cool morning with no wind and make it look easy, and then you come in, say, at Root Ranch at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you're not going to do what you did earlier in the morning. Yeah, absolutely. Amy, you do a lot of teaching, and I know a lot of your students now are more experienced, that sort of thing, but I'm curious about the next generation of aviators.
I saw that question and I was like, wow, that's a great one, because quite honestly, I am so encouraged by these young people coming up. Now, I teach at a university, so they're 19, 20, 21, 22. Probably majority of them are headed to the airlines. I try to corrupt them, So I'm like, what about firefighting? What about, corporate? What about, there's so many other opportunities out there. But they're smart, they're motivated, they're, maybe a lot more worldly in their knowledge than I think I was at that age. And they're thoughtful for the most part. And I'm really encouraged, I am, about the future of aviation in general on these young people. So yay for them.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dick, I know you've been doing a little bit of that as well.
And I just tell young people to follow their heart. You know, I think there is a pilot shortage. There's going to be. It's wide open, whatever you want to do. I never wanted to go with the airlines. I never wanted to make a lot of money at it. I flew over this country when I had 50 hours and a brand new private license, and I wanted the backcountry. I wanted it from the get-go. I wanted everything about it, and it's been a wonderful career, and I think it still can be. It's more challenging because there isn't as much flying. It's harder to make a living, but I think if you want it, you can find a way to make it work.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I flew up here this morning with a young man named Finn who's just about ready to get his student pilots, or is a student pilot, but just about ready to complete his private pilot. And I asked Finn, he just finished high school, you know, what's he doing in the fall? And he said, well, I wasn't going to go to college, but I just went down last week to Embry-Riddle and interviewed, and by golly, he might be going to Embry-Riddle, which wouldn't that be awesome? And so, to your point, Amy, I'm really encouraged that some of these bright, motivated young people want to do careers in aviation. And it's just fantastic. Dick, I'm curious, well, actually, really both of you, what do you feel like your greatest contribution is to aviation?
Education and safety, and I'm guessing Amy's going to answer about the same way. You know, giving back. After you get a certain amount of experience, we have a duty really to try to pass it on and try to make things safer. Someone reminded me a little while ago about an interview done in the Rudder Flutter, the aeronautics publication, and they were interviewing my son when he was at an air show with the F-22, and he was talking about learning to fly from me and the backcountry and how much he liked it. And he said, well, you know, my dad, and I never realized this till I read this in the interview. He said, and he was probably 10 or 12 years old. He said, I know my dad would come home and somebody had died, and my dad would just be sad, and he would take it personally and seriously, and he wanted to prevent that stuff from happening, and made an impact on him at that age, and I think it's still important to do that.
Yeah, well said. Amy, greatest contribution?
Well, yeah, it is along the same lines as Dick. What I find really just kind of gratifying and also special is I've been teaching college now for 25 years. I've been flight instructing for almost 35 years. And I'll randomly get an email or a text or a call from somebody that I haven't heard from in 15 years. It was a former student, maybe came through the program. Or I just got this morning, one sent me a picture, and I said, where was that? And he says, well, I'm flying over here for this airline now. You know, I have former students that are flying in the military. One of our former students is flying Fat Albert for the Blue Angels.
Wow.
Another one of my former students, my claim to fame is I gave him his tail wheel sign-off. Well, he's an F-18 instructor at Top Gun School. You know, another one is the chief trainer at NetJets. You know, they're all over. I'll get on like SkyWest or a Horizon flight, and I'll recognize the voice up front, you know. So that's what's really gratifying for me. It's the whole, you never know when they're in class and you're just trying to help them, or you're in the airplane with them, and then they go off to do amazing things. And that's just, and they want to stay in touch. That's the neat thing, because they say, hey, you were a part of my journey. You were a part of my learning. And that, to me, is worth, you know, any amount of money. If somebody wants to give me money, that's okay. But but just knowing that they appreciate and they're going to pay it forward then again to that next generation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You know, you mentioned floats earlier, or amphibs. I'm just curious, you both are young people and still have a lot of flying in front of you. I'm curious about future goals in aviation, and those floats might be the new one for you, but I'm just curious if there are any other things you want to contribute.
This goes back to that interview we were doing a couple years ago. I want to go to space.
Oh,
that's my dream flight.
Yeah.
Not the Titanic?
No.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we were in Florida. We'd go over watch the Apollo rockets go up, the Saturn rockets, the Apollo missions. We'd go have pancake breakfast and watch then I got to see the space shuttles, and I've just always been enamored. And I've taught a couple of astronauts to fly, actually. One guy was the space shuttle commander.
Wow.
I didn't teach him to fly. I flew with him, but then his wife I taught to fly, and she was the payload specialist.
Yeah.
But so she was an aeronautical. She had a shirt that said, "Yes, I am a rocket scientist." But I don't know. I've just always been enamored with that. I'd love to go into space.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. That would be awesome. Dick, how about you? Any future goals, things you want to do?
I'm enjoying this right here today. When I was flying corporate, every year we had CPR training, and they taught us this song to time our compressions. Staying alive, staying alive. That's kind of my goal.
There you go. That sounds like a pretty worthy goal. It's kind of hard to do anything else if you don't do that.
That's right.
Awesome. Well, I'm just curious from the crowd. We got a good group of people here watching this morning. Anybody have any burning questions? Any things I missed? Anything these guys touched on that you'd love to know a little bit more about?
I have a question. The new airstrip that you were talking about, how high is that going to be? You said it's going to be the highest one.
It's about 8,200. I think I've seen some varying. The old aeronautics book from way back said a little over 8,000. I don't know if now with GPS we've got a little more accurate stuff. It's right in the 80.
Yeah, I think it's around 8,200, but then temperature is going to make the huge difference, right? So density, altitude will be a concern. The approach is pretty straightforward to it, but yeah, we're all going to have to relearn how to fly there.
And where's it located?
It's up kind of off the head of Wilson Creek, right at the beginning of the Bighorn Craigs Wilderness area. So it's about a 3.5-hour drive on a very rough road from Salmon, or about a 20-minute flight in a Cub.
It's a beautiful area. It's a nice little butte there called Sugarloaf, as I recall.
Yeah.
It's just a beautiful rock out there. You just got to go see it. It's just really, really pretty country. Yeah. What else? Paul Collins, you've always got to have a question. You're the one, by the way, we have to thank Paul Collins. He and Billy here are the two that have put this together.
My question would be, if as pilots, what's the one thing we can do to promote and sustain, in your opinion, our sport? What we all give people rides and we bring them here. Is there something that, as educators in the aviation industry, what do you think we need to do? I mean, Billy, we work to educate people about what you've been talking about. Mm-hmm. But what else can we do?
I think that's one of the biggest ones. I was looking on this group that they filed that lawsuit against the Forest Service, and there was an article in the Idaho Statesman, and I started looking into the groups that were behind the lawsuit. I can guarantee you some of them have never even probably been to Idaho or into a wilderness or wherever. They just picked it as a cause, right? Because I'm looking into their groups. And so it's like, if it's a contentious relationship like that, my technique would be, let's go help educate them, the ones that are actually targeting, because they have an idea of what they think it is, but it's probably totally wrong. And so get behind your congressman, get behind the legislature, which the AOPA is a group, that it's going to take money. You got to have backing, you got to have people. So we're doing it at the kind of grassroots level, like giving rides and this kind of thing. But I think it needs to go it needs to go out into the public, into the domain, into the media, into the legislature at that higher level, the state agencies, the advocacy groups like the Recreational Aviation Foundation, AOPA, EAA, all of those groups. We need to help get in and get involved. I'm a judge for scholarships for a seaplane pilots group, and one of the things we're trying to do is increase the number of young people, and especially female pilots and people of color, into this kind of fun regime that not a lot of people do, is seaplane flying and float plane flying. And part of that is helping them, and then they go out and they're advocates because they're all excited about it. I don't know what you got to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I think also awareness. I had a student about a month ago, and we were doing some work in the Middle Fork Canyon, and he had no clue, no concept that it wasn't good to fly down low along through the canyon. There were no boaters in the canyon. It was before the season, but we still had a conversation about it, and he just kind of wanted to push back and said, we have as much right to be here as anybody else. I said, well, yeah, but is it right, or do you want to keep it? There are some very wealthy people with a lot of power who float that Middle Fork every year 10,000 people a summer float that river, and if they see a bunch of low airplanes, that they don't like it, they can rise up against us. And I think an awareness that just because we love aviation, not everybody does, and there are people out there that would like to stop it. And if we want to keep it, we need to be respectful, develop the etiquette, just make people aware of a better way to do things to keep these freedoms we have.
Do the right thing even when nobody's watching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the key.
That's a wonderful bit of advice. Thank you. And on that note, I would like to thank Dick and Amy for sharing all this knowledge with us. We really appreciate it. I want to thank Community Aviation for putting this on. And Billy, you've been just super with these and super with the editing. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. We've got lunch served here just probably about a half hour from now. And please stick around and enjoy the day here at Root Ranch.
Thank you.